Good. All right, so
hello, Stanislas. Welcome.
Hello, Stanislas.
Stanislas is going to be our new panelist. Stanislas, you're muted. If you want to unmute yourself and present yourself quickly.
I'm Stanislas, or Stan. I have a background in environmental and climate change law, among which I've also covered a lot of EU EU legal topics, including the Green New Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. And I worked together with Andrea in a public affairs office in Brussels. So that's how we know each other.
Thank you, Stanislas.
Nice.
It is 8:01. Robin, I think it is time.
Yeah, it is time to start the live. So hello and welcome.
Robin, you're muted.
Oh. So it is 8:01. It is now time to start the live. Hello and welcome to the first live debate organized by Next Wave Network. It's very nice to see people participating. So tonight we will be discussing on the topic of the EU Farm to Fork strategy, and we have two guests to talk about this topic. Our special first guest is Nicole Diano from Reading University. You're actually currently doing some research on technology in agriculture. If you want to introduce yourself and talk about your studies.
Sure. Hi everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I studied political science and international relations for my bachelor. I've been working in Egypt with Robin, this is how I know him, and in Germany in the food industry. And I moved then to England, where I'm finishing my master in agriculture and development right now. And yes, I'm doing some research about climate services in rural areas, and trying to addressing the gender gaps in the use benefit of these services for farmers.
Cool. So we have some people who are joining. So I think we're going to start our discussion in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to lay a bit the ground rules for tonight. So anyone can participate at any time. If you have something to say about the topic, please write in the comment. And if you want to have your say and actually participate with us, you can just write hand, and we will then distribute the hands. So yeah, we have maybe 2 minutes to allow some people to join us. Great. So maybe first roundtable, is everyone here aware of the EU Farm to Fork strategy? I guess if you're joining, probably you are. You can tell us in the comments.
The comment section should be on the right-hand side of your screen if you're using a laptop, by the way. Anyone? I personally was delighted to see the Farm to Fork strategy when it first came out. I thought it was a truly revolutionary piece of legislation. Because not only did it acknowledge the same environmental problems that a lot of pieces of legislation have acknowledged in the past, the solutions that it laid out are going to, if they come to fruition after it goes through, the proper channels, they will truly shake up the agricultural system in Europe, in my personal opinion. So I was really delighted to see it.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting to see that legislation come up right now. I think it's really relevant at the moment. Okay, it is now 8:05. We have 13 people participating. So I guess we can start our discussion. So I think we're going to start by talking about the policy in itself for those who don't know about it. So the EU Farm to Fork strategy was released about 2 weeks ago by the European Commission, and its goal is basically to reduce and mitigate the impact of climate change. And there's a very big it's also very focused on public health and concerned about nutrition. We also have more affordable and healthier food available for Europeans. I think my first reaction and our first reaction with Andrea and Gus was that the policy is really interesting. It's very comprehensive. It's very broad. But actually, is it realistic in a sense? So I guess we can start with Nicole, if you want to give us your thoughts.
Hi. So I think regarding this, that I was really excited to see the Farm to Fork strategy, especially because this 2020 gave us some clear signals that what we were doing before was not enough at all. What we are doing right now is not enough. So just like watching through some natural disasters that occur lately, like the fires in Australia, the problems in Brazil, India, Indonesia, the locust infestations in Africa, South Asia, and of course the COVID-19. So it's a clear signal that we switch from preventing to adapting to these events. And if we don't act right now, this is gonna be like, it's gonna become worse. So I had a really positive reaction to the ambition targets that the Farm to Strategy Fork has, and of course all the approach that comes like together with this. And especially I think like the EU policy that were before, so the one of the 1990 and after the one of the 2003, were not, let's say, complete. So it's the first time that the EU policy is addressing like all the food chain system from the producers to the consumers. So I think it's exciting. But as Robin said, it's like a really broad aspect of all the food chain. So it's the right question to say, is it realistic?
Thank you. Stanislas, do you have something to say about this?
I'm very happy, just like Nicole said, that they really took the holistic approach and really covered the whole, farm to fork sort of supply chain, as well as implementing or sort of including regulations around health, around obesity, and the whole chain. I think that's great, and that was really lacking. To me, the question is going to be whether it's enough in light of the Green New Deal, the 2050 carbon neutral sort of goals we have, and quite frankly, I mean it's a gargantuan task to be doing, especially in a supply chain as complex as the farm and food sector. I'm not sure if we'll get there, but I do think that this is great groundwork for substantial change all across the farm and food chain. So I'm quite hopeful for a complete revision of the whole farm and food sector. I'm not sure about actually reaching climate goals. So I would have liked actually to see a little more adaptation in there, in the farming industry. If you consider that, I think it's 1.5 degrees of between 1.5 and 2 degrees global temperature rise will cause a 50% drop in production in Southern Europe. I mean, that's pretty gnarly. And I think we should have focused more on adaptation. But yeah, anyway, overall, it's absolutely revolutionary, and the holistic approach, if taken, is great. So yeah, not to be too pessimistic.
That's I would say that's actually very interesting that you're saying that it's not enough on certain phase, because what I got for comments is that the farm to fork as well as the biodiversity were too much, in the sense that it's mostly like displaying or showcasing ambitions that will not be achieved, and was more of a comms exercise than a proper ambition behind it.
That is so. The thing is, I'm looking from it from a climate perspective, right? So I'm sure that in the rethinking of the whole food supply chain for other purposes, which could also be environmental purposes, thinking of using less pesticides and integrating more digital solutions, etc. I think that could be a valid critique. If I look towards climate change, however, I'm missing more a proactive stance from the EU, and actually more regulation. The time of farmers or countries to take their own initiative has, we shouldn't have had that sort of regulation for the last 10 years. And if you look at animal production or livestock, there's great initiatives in there about using seaweeds and focusing more on farming fish, etc. But in the end, it doesn't go as far as limiting the livestock production, which is actually what should happen. Now, I know how crazy I sound, because that's ridiculous to demand that from a piece of legislation. So that's why I think this legislation is great. I just don't think it's enough. And I think that's, I don't know. That's just sort of the realization I make. Because I realize how difficult it is to reach goals that would restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees, or at least sort of be on the path towards such a goal. That's why I actually thought that adaptation would be much more important. And I really hope that would be in the legislation more. That's all.
So that adaptation stuff, going to have to take the form of a lot of innovation in terms of technologies coming forward into agriculture and fisheries and every sector that this touches upon, which does seem to be pretty much every sector. It's very ambitious, as everyone says. But what is in your opinion, is the key sort of key things stopping, say for instance, farmers taking up these new technologies?
I think it's a few things. First of all, I don't think that technology can solve everything. If we're looking at adaptation, to me, that is as much trying to reduce things like food waste and water usage than it is actually, using robots in your fields, to ridicule it a little bit. But then the way farmers now, especially under the CAP, get second pillar money for greening initiatives under the eco schemes. And that's all great, right? And that on the long term helps not only to save greenhouse gases and sort of protect biodiversity, etc., but it also does things like provide erosion control, things like agroforestry, where you plant trees over fields, reduce droughts on the ground, which, especially in Southern Europe in a few years, or maybe even this summer, we'll see, might be vital. And these things, I feel, are too often sort of shown as either an option or something nice to do for like nature or whatever. Like it doesn't show in this legislation that it is in the interest of a farmer to actually invest in this. And then, of course, it should also be said that the EU should invest in this. If you then see that in this legislation, those adaptive or sort of more experimental, whatever you would call them, policies are not really integrated, and they're merely talking about greening, using less pesticides. They are talking about combating food waste. I kind of don't see that. I don't think they've taken everything out of those options that they could, and I think that farmers will pay the price for that. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Can I just say one more thing? It's a really stupid example, but it might show a little bit what I mean. Last year in September, it was actually over summer. There was a drought all over France and Spain, etc. And farmers were struggling, as they will this summer, and they probably already are in a lot of areas. And the EU, so farmers were struggling. They had bad crops. They didn't have money because they rely a lot on the CAP schemes to get their direct payments, and then they also rely on the eco schemes to get extra payments. They couldn't really support themselves based just on their crops. So what the EU did was they scrapped some of the ecological provisions under the eco schemes, and sort of increase the payments to farmers whether or not they actually followed any of these regulations. That allowed farmers, for example, to not take into account things like biodiversity strips, where part of their fields are kept for biodiversity purposes. That also stops erosion. And they didn't have to take that into account anymore. Now, for that year, that's great. But on the long term, that doesn't make any sense why they would have done that. And that's kind of maybe what I mean with these adaptive technologies, that the long-term vision and the realization that, all right, we have climate change. We have all these issues here today. Let's work with them.
Yeah. Nice. Nicole, if you have a point of view, because I believe that is actually your specialty about the adaptive measures.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with Stanislas. I think technology, yes, support, yes, but as he said, we need more, because like the question is urgent, and I don't think we realize that how urgent it is. Like, just to see, the targets are there. So just to mention, reaching 25% of the agricultural land under organic land in 10 years, yes, we have to be also realistic. So just to switch from conventional agriculture to organic one, we take at least 2, 3, 4 years. So yes, I don't want to see it so much as ambition. So as he said, probably a good point, but I'm not sure we can force people to do this, is okay, the European Union is helping us, it's helping farmers, it's giving some aids and incentives, but if you don't do this, then you will not have this help anymore. So I'm afraid that maybe this should be the next step to take if the things are continues to go in this direction. So
Nice. Yeah, actually, Stanislas, do you have a opinion? Can you concur on that? I think you're muted. You're muted.
I was actually scratching my nose. I'm sorry.
Okay.
If there's any questions,
yeah.
Maybe. Otherwise, I can. But let's ask some questions first.
Sure. So actually, one of our main questions, because the strategy is so broad, it goes from production to packaging, and there's also consumption in the end. What do you think is going to be the most relevant directive for the next 10 years? Because let's not forget that it's actually a 10-year planning until 2030.
You mean from all the directives under the Green Deal, or?
From this specific farm to fork.
Okay. Nicole, why don't you go? Do you have an idea straight away?
Okay, well, as a student of agriculture, I just can say that, this is my opinion as I study this. So, focus on practices that are sustainable and decrease the damage that we're creating to the earth and to the environment. So, taking a step back and change our practice at the root of the agriculture. So, about the production. So, for example, as he said before, embracing diversity, using practice like plant cover crop. I don't know if you guys knows about conservation agriculture, but I think, like, in my opinion, pushing on this kind of strategies and direction is it's really important to, in the next 10 years, to try to save a little bit the situation. Or I don't know, if push like through the integration pest management kind of services, and of course not at least, but really useful also investments in technology, because I think that if we don't do this, and with technology I mean also services that provides the technology advice and so on, because if we don't invest in these things, at the end, like, I don't think it's going to be useful to do all of this.
Yeah, I completely agree. In my opinion, there are two main focal points that maybe we should take, or we could take. The first of which is doing the calculations and making sure that our greenhouse gas emissions actually drop to a level where we can reach, maybe let's say, the 2-degree goal. Let's be a little realistic. And then investing the rest in adaptation. A second sort of focal point, in my opinion, should be sort of one, agriculture is by far the largest land owner, or, sort of land usage in Europe, industry-wise, of course. And they have, a lot of land means a lot of potential to capture CO2 and greenhouse gases. And they should be incentivized to use a portion of their land for such purposes. You could call it carbon farming, maybe. I don't know if that's a word, or maybe I just came up with it. But you should. But the problem is that these farmers won't do that unless it pays, and that's, I think, very important. And looking into, for example, more and more crop failures that will happen, and that will happen whether or not we act on anything. It might be interesting for these farmers to actually slowly move towards these kinds of options. Of course, provided that there is some sort of funding mechanism, some sort of way from which these farmers can actually gain money. I think those two focal points should be the main focus of, or the most important in the farm to fork strategy. Of course, packaging and the whole food supply chain needs to be looked at. But if you sort of scope that out, then the whole way we live needs to be looked at. If we really want to have short-term, strong action, maybe we should look less into, I'm going to say something very difficult here, maybe we should look less into things like plastic pollution and more into things like biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and then we'll look at the pollution later. Not to say that I think we should do everything, but if we need to pick and choose, we've got a deadline with CO2. We've got 9 years for strong, decisive climate action. If we don't do anything by then, then we're fucked.
We have a hand by Andrea.
Yes, indeed. I just wanted to come back on Stan's previous point that he's also mentioned again here, which was also concurred by Nicole on adaptation. So you guys say that adaptation has been kind of overlooked in this farm to fork strategy. If you were to include it on a purely sort of broad scale policy perspective, what sort of broad scale policy would you put in there?
Do you want to go, Nicole, or should I start?
No, please start. I started before.
All right, fair enough. I mean, you highlighted the most difficult part of this is that, you know, directives are inherently, or any EU legislation for that matter, are inherently very broad. And, you know, I live in Flanders. We have a crazy drought. It's the third year in a row. Droughts are also the case in a lot of Southern Europe. But if you look at, for example, England, they have more issues with storms in the winter period. You know, maybe there's flood. I mean, different places will feel the impact of climate change in a different way. So I think the CAP addressed that already a little bit, in that they were going to, if I'm not mistaken, adapt the eco schemes. Like, the eco schemes need to be there, but the actual implementation of what that looks like specifically is for the states, which I think is great. And if we further that, because you have to think that a lot of these adaptation technologies or you know, ways of adapting your agricultural system to a more both sustainable one and one that can actually catch these droughts and these floods and all these issues, they actually align with a lot of rewilding and biodiversity-rich systems as well. So they kind of go hand in hand, which is why I said that these biodiversity sort of projects should really be framed in this is good for the farmer, which I think is not happening enough today. So to give a clear answer, there is none, but every state should kind of look into that for themselves, but there needs to be some sort of limit. And also some states will need much, much more than other states. I'm thinking of Spain. If Spain wants to keep its agricultural production, well, it will completely need to adapt the way they produce food and have, you know, agroforestry, for example, on a huge scale, while countries in Scandinavia might not actually need that much adaptation. So it's very difficult, but there needs to be some sort of basis, which could be, for example, the amount that we wish to produce as a basis of how successful your adaptation is.
So you're talking about sort of legally binding member states' obligations to draft adaptation plans, very similar to the eco schemes in the CAP, but very specific to this farm to fork and to the adaptation plan change.
And I, to be honest, I don't know why the CAP and the farm to fork are not more aligned in that regard. They should be that should be one system. And I think that could create sort of a system that's big enough to have a huge impact, or to the extent that it's necessary.
Actually, I'm thinking that the farm to fork was a part of the farm to fork was also to revise the CAP. Or actually, it was meant as also a way to revise it. Nicole, if you have an opinion on that, on what we're saying.
Yeah, I think it's essential that the CAP and the farm to fork strategy works together. Otherwise, there's no sense in all of this. And regarding what Stanislas said, I'm totally agree. I can not say nothing more.
We had a hand by Gus. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah. So I think obviously regreening, making agriculture and such like realize that by having biodiversity, we can seriously mitigate a lot of very disastrous impacts in the very about worrying the near future. But we were discussing this actually before the call started as to how out of touch almost it seemed to tell farmers to yeah stop doing what you're like what brings your income in, and we'll pay you for it. There's a big gap in knowledge and understanding, and I want your opinions on sort of do these strategies go far enough in looking at those issues of the disconnect between politicians and the actual people it impacts?
Am I still on? I think I am. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think there's a huge disconnect. And to me, there needs to be, so ideally we would have started this whole transition 30 years ago, and we could have sort of slowly moved the whole agricultural sector to a more sustainable form of producing, and then slowly getting those eco schemes pumped up, etc. But we simply don't have that time. If we want to reach any goal, that's something debatable. We can also say that we don't want to reach certain climate goals and adapt more or something. I don't know. But it's kind of very simple. So I think EU agriculture amounts to about 10.7% or something of greenhouse gases, but they're very potent in the sense that it's mainly animal agriculture. So if you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture is not that bad off, not taking into account animal agriculture. I think they should. There's a bit of a difference between those two. If we're just talking about crop producing agriculture, now we should. I actually think that we should value CO2 at a level that is realistic compared to what every new ton of CO2 can have as damage to the world. I think if you take into account the whole social and economical and all of that value of 1 ton of CO2, I think it was about like $500 or something, US dollars. If you would show that to a farmer, and as the EU say, look, we actually value this to the extent that we should, every farmer from today to tomorrow will just say, all right, I've got this land, well, let's go. Because it's worth so much. And we need to look at farms as huge possible deposits for CO2. Now, of course, we need food, and of course, and we are out of touch in the way that we tell that to farmers. And I'm sure a big issue in that is also that farming is traditional, and people just like to do it, and they've been in there for generations. And those are important things we should take into account. But if we value the potential of actually pulling out CO2 out of the air and using farming as something good rather than something bad in tackling climate change and environmental destruction, then I actually think a lot of farmers would jump on board. That's not happening, so.
But I would say right now, taking the CO2, I wouldn't say it's seen as something bad, but it's definitely not something that is valued. Okay.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. Right now, we give farmers extra money under the cap, second pillar, if they join in for eco schemes. We should tell farmers that it is an option to farm carbon, literally. And of course, then there's big government that needs to come in, because you also need to regulate that. Of course, we still have enough food. We still also take into account breaking down the cattle sort of numbers in EU and etc. But if you show them that already from the beginning, that look, this is actually sort of valuable, you can get money out of this, then I think it's an easier way to get funded, and that is lacking a little bit. So you're right that right now, nor the cap nor the farm to fork strategy are very fair to farmers.
So we had a comment from Charles Cabela. Conservation agriculture is the present and future of agriculture. But more importantly, however, is to ensure that we listen to the people leading farming and build on their experience of working on the lands to secure the future. So actually, that's an interesting point. Maybe Nicole, if you want that, would you say that farmers had a big enough space when building that strategy? Do you think that we actually listened to farmers enough, or is it mostly a purely Euro bubble policy?
Yeah, so hi Charles. Charles is studying with me. He's from Malawi, so I was really interested in knowing also his opinion. So, well, I don't know if you jumped out on the conversation, Charles, when we talked about like, the big difference of knowledge that is like the gap from that could be the EU or like the farmers in general. I totally agree with Robin. I mean, like, I think there is a distance between farmers and what are the institutions or also university in general, because I can say whatever I want, but I experienced this these days. I talked with some farmers and they totally changed my opinion and my mind about what were the targets, if they were reachable and so on. So yes, I think like a top-down approach is important if we really want to see that something will move. Otherwise, it's still going to be just ambitions and target sets just like this. I mean, like we have to hear like the opinion that it's coming from down and not just from the institutions. So I think before we go further with any policy or whatever, it's really important to take in consideration this gap between like the institutions and the farmers. That could be farmers as producers or like small case producers and so on. So yeah.
So there was something actually that I think was mentioned earlier. How do you see that gap? Because that is a European strategy, but obviously there's going to be a big gap in between every member state. How would you say how big would you say is the gap in between the countries? Because I guess this is going to be very favorable for some of them and not work very much for others.
Well, I think there are countries that relies more on agriculture, and there's not like we think about the farm to fork strategies or the CO2 reduction in general or pollution. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are some countries that will be happy, let's say, to put this kind of arguments on the political agenda, but there are others that we not think about just the farms, but like just to mention Poland. Poland is it's like really connected industry of coal. So if you think about Poland, I'm sure they're really concerned about taxes and work jobs related to this. So yes, we talked previously about farmers, but I don't think like we are the only dependent on this. I think like we should look more global point of view if we want to achieve, we really want to achieve in 10 years or 50 years.
It's kind of sad that we have to keep repeating that these goals, which the UN says are vital, that we already have to see them as an option. But I'm afraid that's kind of true. I think, Nicole, you're absolutely right that farmers are only one in a bunch of industries and sectors that will gravely have to change, and that's a whole other discussion. I mean, it's a valid discussion. But if we focus on on farming specifically, Going back to the question on sorry, I lost my track. 1 minute. On the question, we can't afford, and that's actually really good for farmers. We can't afford to lose any knowledge of working land, traditional farming practices, sustainable farming practices. So we can't afford to lose any farmers. If we go about implementing these large-scale new ways of farming, this document, the Farm to Fork strategy, talks already up as well about having more organic farming. Part of that should also be more of this conservation farming, more agroforestry, etc. In all of those things, we need the knowledge of farmers day to day, and I think that it's severely undervalued in a lot of communication coming from the Commission. It's one of the reasons why these the gap between the institutions and the farmer is so big, because in system a farmer would quickly feel undervalued or useless or whatever, and yeah, so I think might have to be highlighted, and that should also be a thing for farmers all around. Know that if you're a farmer, a lot of the future of this continent in your hands. And as long as the Commission or any national government doesn't value that extent they should, then we'll never get anywhere. But once they do, not only will farmers be motivated to step into any sustainability plans or agro-conservation, etc., but they will also like their job, maybe. Like I know in France, farmers, there's a lot of farmers committing suicide. That's a huge problem, and just overall, there's a lot of farmers quitting the sector, and young farmers struggling to get in, etc. While if you look at it from a sustainability point of view, their jobs should be valued at an extent that is way higher than they are today.
Yeah, Nicole, if you want to sum it up.
So yeah, I think it's a lot about addressing information. For example, I'm from Rome. I studied in Berlin, in London. If I talk with farmers from there, they're saying like, "Oh yeah, Green Deal, European strategies, farm to fork." But today, I talk with some farmers from the south of Italy. That's a little bit more the rural area, and they didn't know nothing about this. So this is what I am concerned about. So addressing the information to everybody, not just to people who are into it.
Well, actually, you're giving me a perfect transition on this one, because I want to talk about the spreading of this strategy. Because for the moment, we're 40 minutes into the discussion on the farm to fork strategy, and we basically only talked about the farm part. But what about the fork part? We talk a lot about the production, and we had some great ideas on that. What about the end of that chain, about the consumers? How do you think this strategy is going to impact them? Yeah, Nicola?
I think also in this case we need a total shift of like the mindset of the people, because as consumers, we are really influenced from the environment that is near us, and I think the farm to fork strategies is addressed, or at least is in the right direction regarding this. So yeah, I think like there is a lot of work to do also in this direction.
Okay, so if there was something that you would say is missing on that side from the policy, what would that be?
So switching again to information, like I don't know about you, but I'm following the news every single days, and actually I don't think like the televisions or maybe the social media already a little bit more, but are like reserving such a big space for what's happening now. and for our health, or like what we're consuming about this. Like, of course, like the coronavirus situation took a little bit like a step further to all of this. But I don't know about you, but I think like, again, going back to information, it's not enough what we are doing right now. So I would probably push more on information. And with information, I mean also, like, as I said before, consumers are really influenced of what's happening near us. So also advertisement, or like advertisements that are more healthy, and all these strategies that can influence the consumers.
Actually, Stanislas, I would really like to have your opinion on this one, because this is a matter of public health, but as we know, health is a national concern. It's not a concern of the EU. So, how do you think we can resolve this paradigm to have public health at an EU level with, I guess, information and
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that also surprised me a little bit, is the extent to which health is implemented in the farm to fork strategy. Of course, with the CAP, that was never really, they kind of mentioned that from time to time, but here they really focused on it. And I think ideally the EU would be the best place from which to guide a lot of healthy food transitions and tackle things like obesity. I think that as it is a directive, states will implement it in national legislation in whichever way they do. I just think that on the health side, it's a very powerful move from the Commission, that this is really vital. And also, I don't see how countries can be opposed to it, as the sort of goals are also quite broad. I think a difficulty lies maybe in the link between things like healthy diets and sustainable agriculture, which I think, and I'm sure a lot of people in this panel and in this call today would find obvious, but maybe a lot of member states will find more difficult, especially member states that have a big sort of beef consumption, or whose agriculture is based mainly on beef. For them, that might be a more difficult balance to make. Overall, I think that the Commission is, I mean, they know what they're doing, these guys. They make a very good case for linking sustainability to health through the farm to fork strategy. And I think that's, to me, one of the most powerful bits of the farm to fork strategy, is that they make this link, and they want to tackle obesity, and they understand that a more healthy food chain will ideally also have a more healthy environmental, or less of an environmental impact. And but it's up to the member states to see how they want to implement that state per state, which I think is, that's the way it is. But with food chains being as complex as they are and as transnational as they are, I hope that they will at least sit together when they further implement any of these decisions. I'm going to turn on my light for a minute. Keep going.
I think, Nicole, you want to answer. I also see that there's a hand in the chat by Andrea, so maybe Nicole, you can go. And Andrea, I want to remind everyone that if you want to participate, you can just write hand in the chat, and we will let you speak.
Yeah, I have to say that we did a lot of critics in the previous minutes about the European Commission, how it's addressing all the situation. But regarding like health and food security, I have to say that I'm quite proud, because I think like we never had such a secure system never before. So to say positive things, I'm really proud of what they are doing and what they did also in the previous year.
Okay. Andrea, do you want to have your hand?
Yes, indeed. I just wanted to sort of go on with something that Nicole said. earlier about the lack of information. And I think indeed the big problem with health and sustainability in relation to consumer behavior is lack of information and indeed misinformation in many cases. There is a big problem in Europe with greenwashing, of products to make them look sustainable and make them look healthy. And I just wanted to get both of you guys' thoughts on whether or not the Commission is tackling that enough, especially with the new marketing rules on products which are high in fat, salts, and sugar. Is that enough of a signal to those marketing strategies? I guess we can call them that.
Yeah, Nicole, if you want to go.
So, well, again, it's about information. So what they're doing now about like labeling, I think it's great. Like, I think that at the end, it's about the consumers and the choice that they are doing regarding this. So yes, marketing can be things that it's influencing the situation, but if there are labels there and they're telling us what's there inside, it's just about us. So they're kind of giving us the opportunity to make the choice. Then it's on us if we want to do it or not.
But actually, if there is such a secure system, if we want to look at it and maybe change it, then it's the more secure the system, the hardest it is to change in the end.
What do you mean?
Do you mean a food labeling system, or what do you mean exactly?
Not only the food labeling system, but I think Nicole has said you were very proud of it because it's a very secure system. By now, I guess there's a lot of quality checks. If we want to actually raise some standards for on the foods, isn't it, especially on the food processing, I would say, isn't it very hard to change if there's already so many layers? Because that's a lot of administration, so that's a lot of administration to update also.
I'll say that it's of course going to be really difficult to change. Exactly, things like quality standards, food labeling, etc. But the fact that that is already regulated by either the EU or member states in some sort of coordination with one another, that means a lot. Food labeling they're going to change it now, but for a long time that was a private deal, and it was up to companies, and companies, they got some lobbyists on hand or some marketeers, companies, and they created a little group, and they then said, oh, this product is green, while it's really just paying into that scheme. The fact that you have the ability as a government to influence that, however difficult it is a big step. Realizing that, taking into account that a couple of years ago, that was all just unregulated completely. So the more cards we have in our hands, the more complex everything becomes. But it still means that the cards are in our hands, and it's not up to companies to decide any of these things.
Yeah, that's actually pretty encouraging to think that we are the one who can actually change it. It's not up to only industry.
Because in the end, I feel that these things are too often left to the sort of to the choice of a consumer. It's seen as a right. When companies create these food labeling systems and any sort of health claims or whatever, the information aspect is too often seen as a plus and never seen as a consumer right or a form of consumer protection. When a government steps in and decides to regulate, take over these labeling systems, that narrative completely changes. And when that happens, you don't even have to change much, but you'll regain trust between consumers and producers. Hopefully, maybe trust between consumers and governments. and you have the ability to create a narrative that is guided by information and fact rather than companies.
Actually, because we're talking about labeling, and earlier I think it was Andrea who mentioned the problem of greenwashing. I had a question about how can we make all the new legislation accessible to the people, because ultimately you're saying we have the cards in our hands, and but it's only the businesses who are going to be interested in actually digging into that legislation, because it's very complicated to get into. It's a lot of pages. Would it be actually useful to make this legislation accessible to a wider audience?
I think that discussion, the information discussion, is at the crux of what the EU has done wrong for the last 40 years. They're really bad at communicating, really bad. Look at what things like the Brexit Party or the UKIP got away with so much stuff, claiming all these things, all these falsehoods, and the EU never had the guts to step in and say, well, actually, that's not true, or proactively explain what they're trying to do. And it's the same thing with this. Now that they're going to, it's through states. So I think that's maybe a difference. I don't want to just shove it all in one pile. It's up to states to implement these regulations. So you could say that it would be up to states to explain to their citizens or consumers what they're trying to do. On the other hand, if you set universal standards on things like labeling, etc., then you could also say that the EU should have the guts to explain what they're doing. Mainly, and that is also, it's not only about this food aspect, but I think also it's one of the problems that on the farming side is very vital, is they should discuss with stakeholders proactively and inform consumers and citizens in a much clearer way. And I feel that quite often they lack the guts to do so.
Okay, that's interesting. It actually hurts a bit, to be honest, because I was personally working in the Commission's communication. But well, it's good to have some feedback. Nicole, actually, I wanted to ask you something that Stanislas just talked about. You talked about setting up standards. Do you think that with this strategy we can set up standards that go beyond the EU? Maybe on other markets, such maybe America, Latin America, Africa, or even Asian markets?
Right. I think I didn't hear the last part of the question.
I'm sorry, my question was about would this strategy be able to set up standards for markets beyond the EU, so maybe for the African market or Latin American markets? Because I think that's also what you're working on.
Yeah, well, it's a tough question. I mean, it's a complex and global system. So I think, like, answering also to the previous question, better policy coordination and coherence between not just our state but world in general. It's for sure it's a good thing, and there's also a huge word between the words and the practical application at the end. But I think that we can be an example for the entire world. And regarding trade, here the question it's a little bit hard, because if we say we switch to organic, we switch to bio, but if we say then we have to import food in a cheapest say, price or whatever. We have to calculate every step of this. So yes, we're doing so, but if the other countries are not doing so, and we have to import from the other countries, then how sustainable for real it is. So
Actually, that's pretty interesting. But we are running out of time. Considering we're talking about health, there is an obvious question that we try to avoid up until now, but we'll have to talk about it. Is considering there's that COVID-19 crisis and there's a big economic crisis coming with it, how realistic do you think it is to implement it now, especially if it's a strategy that's up for 10 years?
Little question. I think that we should take. So there's two ways to look at this. It's a crisis, and it is a crisis. It's also an opportunity. We'll hit rock bottom, but if we apply, I don't know, Naomi Klein's shock therapy, then the shock doctrine. I'm sorry. Then we could also say that this is a great opportunity, and we should take any opportunity on which a government, be it EU or national, to have an influence through economic means to push for more sustainable practices, then we can't afford to let that slide. We can't make the same mistake as we did in 2008 by just bailing things out and just supporting things and not taking environment into account at all. We need to do better. And I'm not saying that this situation made it easier to implement these vast changes that are necessary. But I think that if you change your perspective a little bit and realize that there will need to be some sort of, pump of money in the economy, to describe it quite plastically, then we can have some green strings attached. And this is the moment to attach those green strings. And if we don't do it now, and then in a few years we'll have business as usual and we'll have missed this opportunity. We should have done everything yesterday. And that takes a lot of guts. And as I said a few times, I feel that maybe the Commission doesn't have those sometimes. But it'll be a sad day if we don't take this opportunity and climate and environment is put on the back burner. That'll be very sad.
Nicole, you want to build up on that?
yeah, regarding this, I think it will be more expensive to restore the old economy and all these aspects than to build a new green recovery. But the point is, I'm super happy to have this conversation with you because we think a little bit on the same way, but I'm not sure that everybody will think in this way. So as he said, probably it's now the point to talk about this stuff because we can see it as an opportunity. But I'm concerned about the political agenda if they really will, like as a nation, will put this at the first level. Like I am super happy again. I think like we all think in the same direction, but I'm concerned, to be honest, because I don't want that this coronavirus is taking a little bit like the place of like the place in a mediatic way, or also like as a strategy on the other one. It could be the economical one, or like invest in other kind of structures or sectors that is not this one.
Yeah, I guess especially when you talked earlier about information and access to information, and a lot of people who were very interested in those topics, but who didn't even hear that it came out because everything on TV and on the paper is about COVID-19. So actually, we're running out of time now. So if you want to have one last word, maybe a concluding word on the strategy, that would be your time. And just want to remind everyone that if you want to have a last say, write it now.
Do we wait for the last say, or do we just go for it?
Ah, go for it. Go for it.
I think the farm to fork strategy is an exceptional piece of legislation. I think it's a major stride in both rethinking our food systems in the health, on the health side of it, as well as the environmental side of it.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I just hope that it won't become a sort of blanket of non-action, and I hope that it won't become a flex in greenwashing. That would be really sad. So I hope this will spur more action, more directives, more ambition, and I hope that, as I said earlier, that the COVID-19 crisis could actually be a spark in that change. And if not, and if it's only this farm to fork strategy that will define EU agriculture and food systems for the next 10, 20 years, then we won't reach any climate goals. And we'll definitely have to have something new, because then we'll, have a 50% cut in our production. Not to be too negative.
Nicole, do you want to conclude this meeting?
Yeah, well, I agree. I think that the transition is essential and is urgent, much more of what we think. So I think it's also important to spread this conversation that we had now with everybody. So not between us, but also with other friends, with our family, with other generation that could be our relatives or whatever. Because I think it's important that we start to talk about it, and we need to talk about it more and more and more. Otherwise, it's going to be just something that it's going to stay between us and the governments.
Yeah, just real quick, this is the ultimate echo chamber. So everyone that's listening to this is already convinced that there is, a lack of action. So it's up to every one of us to spread the news, spread action. I don't know. Yeah, that's all.
Great. Well, thank you both for participating. Thank you everyone who joined us and who listened up until now. It's really nice that you joined. Don't hesitate to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and go read our articles on the blog. I think it was a very nice experience. Again, I want to thank you both for joining. That was our first time connecting live. I think it went pretty well, and I hope we're gonna do more very soon.
Yeah, I just want to add really quickly that we will be drafting a policy proposition paper out of the debate that's been going on this evening, and all the participants will be welcome to sign it before we send it to the EU Commissioner for Agriculture.
Yeah, we'll be drafting up from the very long notes that we've got from this, and definitely try and pass it around and get as many opinions as we possibly can on that. It's been a great experience, and yeah, thank you all for joining.
And as it was massively emphasized tonight, we need as much input as possible from as many backgrounds as possible, countries and professional backgrounds. So don't hesitate to share this project with people that you know, and we will obviously have some more communication on it on our social pages. So thank you everyone for joining, and yeah.
That you gave us this opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Right. Bye bye everyone.
All right.
Right.
Bye.
Thanks and good night.
Yeah, bye bye.
Okay, so it's only us three now.
That was pretty fun.
Oh man, that actually went really well, I think. That was cool.
We owe you one. We owe you one.
Yeah, thanks mate. Thanks for joining us. Plus at the very last minutes. That was really cool.
I should just talk for a living. That'd be
Robin,
cool.
is the live over on YouTube?
And the live is not over on YouTube. Not really sure how to. Okay, there you go. And the live is over! And now we can